If Luffy found the Death Note, the entire mechanics of how the notebook operates would collide with a mind that doesn't process consequences, linear text, or long-term stakes the way normal people do. When Ryuk drops the book into the world, he attaches himself to the human who picks it up. If that person is Luffy, Ryuk is immediately locked into a psychological nightmare. Luffy's attention span does not allow for reading a page of rules written in English Gothic script. He would flip through the pages, see that they are blank, and his mind would instantly categorize it as useless paper. Because his brain requires high stimulation or immediate utility, a blank notebook is boring. Ryuk would try to initiate the classic dialogue, explaining that writing a name causes a heart attack in 40 seconds. But Luffy's focus shifts rapidly based on physical stimuli. If a seagull flies overhead or if he smells smoke from Sanji's kitchen, he will literally walk away mid-sentence. Ryuk would be left standing on the deck, completely ignored, while Luffy chases a beetle or tries to do a handstand on the ship's railing. Because Luffy cannot sit still with abstract concepts, the notebook would quickly become a physical object used for entirely non-intended purposes. People with severe ADHD often find alternative uses for objects based on immediate need rather than intended function. Luffy would use the Death Note to prop up an uneven table in the galley, or tear out a page to wrap a piece of leftover meat so grease doesn't get on his shorts. The danger would happen entirely by accident, driven by Luffy's habit of hyper-focusing on random visual details when he is supposed to be doing something else. During a serious strategy meeting where Nami is explaining a map, Luffy's brain would understimulate. To keep his hands moving, he would grab the notebook and a pen. He wouldn't think about killing anyone. Instead, his brain would latch onto the physical memory of names he's seen on wanted posters. He might try to practice writing his own name because he likes how the letter L looks, which would terrify Ryuk, only for Luffy to get distracted halfway through and write a different name he saw earlier that day, like a local warlord or a marine captain. Because the notebook requires the writer to picture the person's face, Luffy's memory would naturally flash to the angry face of the guy who refused to give him food. He wouldn't be writing to execute them. He would be doodling them because his brain is recycling recent visual stimuli. The 40-second rule would create an absolute disconnect. 40 seconds is too long a gap for Luffy to connect cause and effect when he's already moved on to 3 other thoughts. If a Marine Admiral suddenly dropped dead on a nearby ship 40 seconds after Luffy scribbled his name, Luffy wouldn't make the correlation. He would look across the water, say, "Oh, that guy fell down," and immediately go back to trying to catch a fish with his bare hands. Eventually, the notebook would be lost entirely. It would fall overboard during a storm, or Usopp would accidentally use it as kindling to start a fire for a gadget he's building. Ryuk would be left completely defeated, not because Luffy overcame the temptation of the notebook, but because Luffy's brain operates on a frequency where a book that kills people simply cannot compete with the immediate, visceral reality of wanting to eat, fight, and hang out with his friends. The dynamic between Monkey D. Luffy and the operational rules of the Death Note creates an absolute void where structural logic and narrative stakes go to die, completely breaking the psychological framework established by Light Yagami. In a traditional narrative, the notebook requires meticulous calculation, absolute secrecy, and a hyperfixation on cause and effect. Luffy's severe attention deficit characteristics completely flip this dynamic, turning a weapon of ultimate cosmic terror into a background object of total chaos, driven entirely by his inability to focus on abstract consequences or sit still for more than 40 seconds. When the broadcast collision occurs, Luffy doesn't engage in a silent battle of wits with L. Taylor. He doesn't listen to the speech, nor does he register the traps laid out by the world's greatest detective. His brain simply processes the immediate auditory stimulus of being called a coward, reacting with visceral frustration while completely ignoring the name or identity of the person speaking. Instead of writing a name, his hands require immediate physical engagement to release understimulated energy, causing him to aggressively scribble a giant, crude doodle on the blank pages using a broken red crayon. Because his brain associates the insult with the giant letter on the screen, he draws a massive, jagged letter L with a melted potato face next to it, unconsciously fulfilling the condition of picturing the victim's face while writing down the only identifier his mind retained. When the decoy drops dead 40 seconds later, the temporal gap is far too wide for Luffy's working memory to connect his drawing to the event across the sea. By the time the real L announces the regional trap through the static feed, Luffy has already transitioned into a completely different thought process, crawling under his desk to search for a dropped coin or demanding rice from the kitchen, leaving Ryuk in a state of absolute psychological exhaustion. This complete lack of executive functioning continues to shield him during the undercover investigations, notably during the bus hijacking event. While an undercover agent like Ray Penber sits nearby, sweating and waiting for a calculated move from a criminal mastermind, Luffy's focus is entirely trapped by high-contrast visual stimuli, specifically the shiny, metallic skull buckle on the hijacker's belt. When the armed criminal threatens the passengers, Luffy doesn't formulate a multi-step proxy execution. He acts on immediate physical impulse, lunging forward with hyperactive speed to grab the shiny object because his brain demands the instant gratification of touching a cool pirate accessory. This unpredictable physical escalation terrifies the hijacker, forcing him backward out of the moving vehicle and directly into the path of a truck, coincidentally executing a sequence that perfectly matches a crude sea monster drawing Luffy had scribbled hours earlier on a piece of scrap newspaper to keep his hands busy during breakfast. The undercover agent watches this unfold and attributes it to a terrifying, godlike intellect that can manipulate human behavior with microsecond precision, completely unaware that the suspect is currently chewing on a piece of lint under the bus seat. When brought face to face with L at the university, the psychological warfare collapses entirely. L drops his identity like a heavy weight, expecting a spike in adrenaline, a subtle shift in posture, or a calculated mask of innocence. Instead, Luffy's brain processes the information without any social filter or fear mechanism. He screams the identity out loud to the entire crowded courtyard, thoroughly shattering L's low-profile security guidelines within 3 seconds. When L tries to explain the tactical checkmate of the situation, Luffy completely bypasses the intellectual premise, focusing instead on L's physical appearance, calling him a raccoon man, and aggressively demanding a fistfight behind the cafeteria because physical action is the only currency his brain values when a conversation becomes too long and abstract. This pattern repeats during the corporate investigations, where Luffy is chained to the detective. While L spends hours meticulously stacking sugar cubes and building probabilistic models of corporate stock manipulation, Luffy uses the steel chain as a personal jump rope, completely understimulated by data screens. His eventual hyperfixation on L's strawberry shortcake leads to a violent, physical scuffle over food that ends with both of them crashing into the main control panel. Luffy's flailing elbow accidentally strikes the facility's red emergency lockdown button, triggering a massive security breach alarm that panics the hidden corporate conspirators into burning their evidence and exposing their identities on live camera. L sits in the wreckage, completely convinced that Luffy simulated a clumsy fall to force a psychological breakdown in the targets, viewing a chaotic accident as the peak of human genius. The tragedy reaches its climax during the heavy rainstorm on the roof of the headquarters. The massive sensory input of the downpour finally brings a rare, heavy stillness over Luffy's hyperactive mind, grounding him in the immediate physical reality of the storm. When L speaks of hearing distant, symbolic funeral bells, Luffy rejects the abstraction, focusing instead on the tangible rhythm of the thunder and the physical discomfort of L's freezing, mud-covered feet. Dropping to his knees, Luffy uses his own sleeve to clean the detective's feet simply because his brain operates on direct empathy and immediate physical needs rather than long-term existential threats. When Rem eventually writes L's real name in the notebook to protect Misei, the sudden heart attack strikes the detective down in the sterile computer room. As L falls, he expects to see the cold, victorious smirk of Kira finally revealing itself. Instead, he dies looking into the raw, tear-streaked face of a boy who is genuinely heartbroken by the loss of his weird, boring friend, screaming at him to wake up because dinner is finally ready. Luffy remains completely oblivious to the fact that the black notebook sticking out of his own back pocket.